interests me are not just the sordid little stories of Hollywood. Somehow they transcend into tragedy.
I predict that Broadway plays will soon have casts entirely in the nude, and depiction of the sex act, normally or perverted, will not be unusual. This will mark a renewal of legitimate theater, for it will mean that such acts may be portrayed in theater before they will be portrayed in the movies. However, Broadway's exclusive franchise shall not last long. Soon, movies will follow Broadway. There will be movie houses specializing in such movies, operating openly in the USA.
Good afternoon. What you just heard was the AI voice of Criswell, whom you may remember from Plan 9 from Outer Space. He was a TV psychic in the 1950s, and that was an excerpt from his book, Criswell Predicts From Now to the Year 2000. And it's somewhat relevant to our story today. But before we get started, I'd like to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to come on yet another little trip with me. Or, if this is your first time here, then welcome. My name is Dan Watkins, and this is Between the Dial, and it is a project where we attempt to plot a long, strange road trip through the dark heart of Los Angeles in hopes of uncovering a hidden geography that sits right atop our own. Sort of like how this strip mall sits right atop where our first location used to be. We are on Santa Monica Boulevard, which, despite being parallel to Sunset Boulevard, is a world away from the Sunset Strip. Instead of the Strip, we are in West Hollywood, between Crescent Heights and Havenhurst, and we are standing next to a day spa. Where this day spa now stands is in the former site of the Starwood nightclub. Despite existing for only 8 years, the Starwood was one of those music venues that proved to be indispensable, specifically in fostering the burgeoning punk scene in Los Angeles. Seminal proto-hardcore band The Germs, led by Darby Crash, and featuring Pat Smear on guitar, who would of course go on to play with Nirvana and then the Foo Fighters, recorded a live album here in December 1980. Before it was the Starwood, it was called PJ's, and it was owned by Elmer Valentine, quite possibly the most influential club owner in Los Angeles music history. He would sell the club and then go on to found 3 institutions that still grace the Strip to this day: the Whiskey, the Roxy, and the Rainbow Room. So while Elmer went off to claim his place amongst the gods of venue ownership, the ill-fated PJ was snatched up by a man named Eddie Nash. Eddie was born in 1929 in Palestine to an Orthodox Christian family in Rolla. His family was in the hotel business. They owned 48 of them, and by all accounts were quite successful. However, when Israel was created in 1948, they found themselves displaced and living in a refugee camp. Furthermore, to make matters worse, Eddie Nash's brother-in-law was murdered by Israeli soldiers. So, young Nash did what he had to do, and he fled to the USA in the early 1950s, with $7 in his pocket. One thing to know about Eddie is that he was very good on a horse, an expert by all estimations, and was soon able to find work as a stuntman and bit player, landing a small role on a Western serial called The Cisco Kid. He played a character called Nash. That was, however, about as far as his acting career got. Though, through his connections, he was able to open a sandwich shop on Hollywood Boulevard called Beef's Chuck. Through hard work, he was able to leverage that business into the purchase and operation of several nightclubs around Los Angeles, the Starwood among them. Similar to the founders of the Sunset Strip, Eddie Nash saw the untapped earning potential in running businesses that catered towards teens, punks, and the queer community. Though hard work may have been a little misleading. In addition to being overseer of a small empire of restaurants and nightclubs, Eddie Nash had also become heavily involved in cocaine trafficking and otherwise running an organized crime racket. Now, to continue our story, I'd like to leave this dreary strip mall and head to a place where the vestiges of the past are more visible and touchable, if you're brave enough. We are staying on Santa Monica and heading to number 7734. When you arrive, you'll see it for exactly what it is. An abandoned theater. But an abandoned theater with some history. It opened as the Monica in 1940 and was designed by an architect whose name has been lost to history. By the 1960s, it began to slide from legitimate cinema, quote-unquote, to softcore films, and it was rechristened the Left Bank Theater in 1968, where it would drop the pretense altogether and exclusively show porn films. In 1970, it was once again rechristened, and it became the evocatively named Pussycat Theater. And under that name is where it would see its most successful years by far. Lines around the block would show up for The Devil and Mrs. Jones and Deep Throat as hardcore films became a chic way to spend an evening. The Pussycat is long gone now, but the building remains, so I encourage you to get out of the car and walk towards the front door, and stand under the awning. It'll provide a little bit of refuge from the sun. You'll like it. Once there, look down at the sidewalk, and you'll probably see a whole bunch of leaves and maybe some trash, but push that aside with your foot and you'll see some handprints and shoe prints and writing. Sort of like a bizarro world version of the Prince of the Stars at the Chinese theater. And it kind of is, because this is the Porn Walk of Fame. Stroll past the tiles and you'll see Golden Era stars like Harry Reams, Linda Lovelace, Marilyn Chambers, and of course, the reason we came here, John Holmes. Holmes enshrined his appendages into the cement here in February 1985, during the waning years of the Golden Era. A few years earlier, however, John Holmes was one of the biggest, no pun, adult film stars in the industry. John was born in Asheville, Ohio in 1944 to a woman named Mary June Holmes. There was no father listed on his birth certificate, though it was likely a man named Carl Estes. Mary's 3 other children were sired by a man named Edgar Holmes, and it was Edgar who would assume the role of young John's stepfather. Weird fact, Mary and Edgar were divorced and married 4 times. To one another. Sorry, I just think that's worth mentioning. John actually wouldn't learn that Carl was his real father until well into adulthood when he applied for a passport. Alas, Mary was a devout Baptist, and Edgar, to his credit, was a terrible alcoholic. So they finally called it quits when Holmes was a small child, and she took the kids to another town in Ohio and lived in a housing project. Holmes would finally leave home at the age of 15 and join the army. With his mother's permission, of course. He spent the majority of his 3 years in the army in West Germany, and once he got out in 1963, he decided to head, as so many do, to Los Angeles. And like so many do, he struggled. Struggled for a good long while, in fact. He worked odd jobs, door-to-door selling, chocolate factory, that kind of stuff. But eventually he fell into ambulance driving, and through it, he met a nurse named Sharon. They got married 8 months later, and John Holmes took up forklift driving in a meat packing plant, which would end up giving him a whole slew of health problems, including a collapsed lung from going back and forth from the hot desert air to the sub-zero walk-in freezer. It was during his time on disability, while recovering from the lung issues, that John Holmes would enter into the line of work that would bring him his greatest accomplishments and indirectly send him to an early grave. It is at this point that, for story purposes, I need to let those of you who are unaware know that John Holmes has a large penis. There. That's out of the way. So the apocryphal story, the kind of story I often prefer, is that John was at a poker club in Gardena. While in the restroom of said club, he met a photographer at the urinal, who happened to, quote, get a good look at Holmes, and told him he could probably put that thing to work and make a decent living with it. The photographer put him in contact with a few pornographers, and John started out by posing for a few pictorials, which led to some nightclub dancing, which led to some stag films, and all of a sudden Holmes found himself making more money than he ever had, and all the while his wife Sharon had no clue. She did get a little suspicious that something was up when she walked in on him one day, measuring himself. She thought it was a weird thing for him to do, but he seemed downright giddy, according to her. It was in this moment that he confessed. Confessed that he was in the throes of a burgeoning porn career. Not only did he tell her that, but he also declared that he hoped to make it his life's work. Sharon was not in love with the idea. Not for nothing, but she was a virgin when she met John, and her ideal domestic situation was a bit more square than what John was proposing. However, he assured her that it was just a job, like being a carpenter, he said. When he leaves work, he leaves his tools there. She didn't quite see it like that and told John that she felt like she was married to a prostitute. They would continue this back and forth for another 15 years of marriage. John would go off and make his Johnny Wad films, and when he wasn't on set, he would work as a handyman at one of the 10 apartment units that Sharon managed. He did manage to keep his double life in check for a while, but as Johnny Wad, he was earning $3,000 a day at his peak, and the lifestyle it afforded was all too enticing for Holmes to only enjoy part-time. You see, Holmes was, by all accounts, a piece of shit, if you don't mind me editorializing. And in 1976, at the age of 32, he began a quote-unquote relationship with a 15-year-old girl named Dawn Schiller. Soon, Holmes was calling her his girlfriend, which is skin-crawling enough on its own, but the situation was made all the more dangerous by the fact that Holmes was in the beginning of a slow descent into full-blown cocaine addiction. Indeed, before long, Holmes would become so addicted to cocaine that he would be unable to perform, which of course resulted in him losing work, and so it went, and eventually, despite earning those $3,000 a day checks, Holmes found himself broke. Since fucking on camera was out of the question, Holmes resorted to forcing Dawn into prostitution. When she objected, he beat her savagely until she relented. He took all the money she earned and made her wait in the car while he would go to score drugs. And that car was, more often than not, parked out in front of Eddie Nash's place. Eddie liked having John around for a couple of reasons. He was, despite everything, still a star. And who doesn't like having a star around the house? But more than that, Eddie liked John because John was desperate. To make extra money, John was stealing luggage from LAX, and he would take those spoils to Eddie and sell them. At the same time, however, John was falling in with a group of dealers and drug runners who operated out of a house in Laurel Canyon. And that's where I'd like us to head now. 8763 Wonderland Avenue. Now, the people who own this house nowadays do not like people driving up the hill to gawk and take selfies. So we're gonna park at the bottom of the hill and take a walk. Good thing it's such a nice day. It's a tall, skinny house, and the street up here is thick with foliage. It's pretty quiet, despite being so close to the connective artery between Hollywood and the Valley. This is the house that the eponymous Wonderland gang would use as their clubhouse. And to them, John was a useful drug runner, serving as a mule between their house and Eddie Nash. Even better, they didn't even have to pay him. At least not in cash. They would just pay him in drugs. The thing is, though, about that, of the many things that you shouldn't trust a raging drug addict with, the biggest thing is probably transporting the drugs you intend to sell. And so, inevitably, John Holmes would ultimately find himself in debt to the Wonderland gang. Being desperate, as I mentioned, and being a piece of shit, as I also mentioned, John offered up his friend, Eddie Nash, as a means of paying off what he owed. He endeavored to help the Wonderland gang rob Eddie. The thing is, Eddie was also a piece of shit, and one of the particularly ruthless variety. He was notoriously violent, and short-tempered, and disgusting. I am going to impart an anecdote now that is pretty vile, so if you don't want to hear it, maybe skip ahead 15 seconds. Now. Alright, so apparently one of the things he liked to do was go to the bathroom, take a shit, and then offer women cocaine to lick him clean. There you go. I've lived with that mental image, and now it's yours. He was also known for inflicting violent retribution on anyone who crossed him. Stuff of the pull all of your teeth out and bury you in the desert variety. One year, John Holmes offered Dawn to Eddie as a Christmas present, and during sex, he punched her so hard that one of her front teeth pierced her lip. I say all of this to paint a picture of the type of man the Wonderland gang, who by all accounts were a bunch of low-level dirtbags, were thinking that they could rob. And in all fairness, rob him they did. On the day of the robbery, John Holmes went over to Eddie's house, as he was wont to do. After all, they were friends, right? However, when he left Eddie's house, he made sure to leave the sliding glass door open, as he was alleged to have promised the Wonderland gang he would. Once Holmes told the gang that the door was open, they drove down Laurel Canyon to Eddie's house in Studio City and robbed him of about $1.3 million in jewelry, antique guns, and cash. They snorted cocaine off his daughter's vanity, yelled racial epithets at him, and humiliated Eddie by sticking a pistol in his mouth. Also, in the course of all of it, Nash's bodyguard was shot and injured. Eddie immediately suspected John Holmes, because he remembered the whole thing with the sliding glass door, and he sent his injured bodyguard to go find him. And find him he did, just walking around Hollywood wearing one of Eddie Nash's rings. The bodyguard nabbed John and brought him to Eddie. Back at Eddie's place, Liberace's boyfriend, Scott Thorson, was hanging out doing cocaine. I know the whole thing sounds wild, but yeah, the guy who Matt Damon played in a TV movie by Steven Soderbergh was sitting on Eddie's couch doing coke when Eddie's bodyguard burst in with Holmes and tied him to a chair. Scott watched as Eddie and the bodyguard took turns wailing on John so that he would tell them who was behind the robbery. And give them up he did, because ultimately John Holmes was spineless and not really thinking too far beyond his next fix. Now that Eddie knew the identities of his attackers, it was only a matter of time. That time came at 4:30 a.m., July 1st, 1981. On that morning, 2 days after the robbery, an unknown number of, to this day, unidentified assailants entered the Wonderland house and bludgeoned 4 people to death, using what is believed to be a combination of metal pipes and hammers. There were, however, 5 people inside. Susan, the wife of a gang member, survived the attack, but her brain damage was so severe that she was left with permanent amnesia, and as such was unable to identify her attackers. It was actually her groans of agony that alerted some furniture movers next door that led to the discovery of the scene. The initial investigation into what is objectively a brutal crime scene, you can check out the photos if you don't believe me, centered its target around one man, John Holmes, whose handprint had been found on a headboard in one of the victims' blood. Holmes was tried on 4 counts of murder, but was ultimately acquitted as they couldn't conclusively prove that he actively participated in the bludgeoning. As far as how the handprint got there, reports differ, but it seems as though Holmes led the murderers to the Wonderland home and either chose to stay and watch, or more likely was forced by Eddie Nash to stay and watch these 5 people get their heads caved in. This narrative is substantiated by Holmes's wife, Sharon, who said that she remembered that he came home covered in blood the day of the murder, and told her, point blank, that he led 3 people to a drug house and watched them beat everyone inside to death. He never did tell her the identity of the killers. Speaking of his wife, though he was a free man, all of the hubbub surrounding the murder finally proved too much for Sharon. That's right, during all of this, he was still married to Sharon. During all of the adult filmmaking, all of the cocaine freebasing, all of the having a 15-year-old girlfriend, Sharon had stuck by him. The murders, however, were too much. Dawn also left John around this same time. And so would begin John Holmes's long slide towards an early death. He still made sporadic appearances in adult films, and in 1982 he met a fellow performer named Laurie Rose, who was 19 years old to his 38. 5 years later, they would get married in Las Vegas, but at that point, Holmes was harboring a secret that few people outside of Laurie were aware. John Holmes was dying of AIDS. It is not known how he contracted it. Could have been through his cavalier sexual practices. Could have been the drugs, though most contend that despite his appetite for narcotics, John hated needles. Either way, in true piece of shit fashion, John continued to perform in adult films despite being fully aware that he was sick. And he told no one, exposing his scene partners without their knowledge. Holmes finally died after convalescing in the VA hospital on Plummer Street, in Sepulveda, which is now known as North Hills, on March 13th, 1988, at the age of 43. He made one dying wish of his new wife, Laurie, that she make sure that when he's cremated, that all of his body parts remain intact. Thinking about his dick to the very end, Holmes was paranoid that someone was going to try to cut it off after he died, and preserve it in a jar somewhere, like they supposedly did to Rasputin. Lori fulfilled the request, saying that she stayed with him until they closed the box and pushed him into the oven. Then she took his ashes and scattered them at sea off the coast of Oxnard. Eddie Nash was also tried for his role in the Wonderland murders. Twice, actually. The first time ended in an 11-1 hung jury, though Nash admitted to bribing the lone holdout in order to make that happen. By the time he confessed to that bribery, though, the statute of limitations had long elapsed. His second trial ended in an acquittal, and that was that. Eddie lingered on into the 1990s, continuing to be dogged by authorities for his various criminal enterprises. He would get raided, he would beat the charges, get raided, beat the charges, so on and so forth, until finally they got him. In September 2001, of all times, on RICO charges, and he spent 4 years in prison. After his release, he puttered on for another decade until finally dying in 2014 at the age of 85. The Wonderland murders to this day remain unsolved. So, let's head back down the hill, shall we? Probably for the best. I think the owners might be getting suspicious of us. Interestingly enough, the Starwood nightclub died the same year as the Wonderland murders, 1981, though, best I can tell, the two are not related. In truth, the city of West Hollywood had been trying to shut down the Starwood for years, for noise, underage drinking, that sort of thing, just generally being a nuisance. Less than a year before they shut down, I mentioned that the Germs recorded a live album there, but what I didn't mention is that their lead singer, Darby Crash, would die 4 days later of a suicidal heroin overdose at the age of 22. That's not necessarily related to our story today, though I like to think all these things are connected in some way. Anyway, just ahead of its scheduled demolition, the building formerly known as the Starwood caught fire, not unlike many other Nash-run businesses that were falling into the red. Probably just a coincidence, though, right? Anyway, enjoy the night, whether you're headed to the Valley side or back down into Hollywood. Maybe go see what's happening at the silent movie theater. I don't know. Whatever you do, of course, drive safely. Between the Dial was written and produced by me, Daniel Watkins. And for whatever reason, if you can't get enough of me talking or scary stories, then Christina Santa Cruz and I host horror movies every Wednesday in October and November over on landturtlerecords.com. So go on over there, check that out, and all of the other stuff we do. That's landturtlerecords.com. And if you want to follow me on social media, I am at Epcot Fitzgerald. That's Epcot_Fitzgerald. Good night, y'all.